Hello. Hello, my name's Gordon, and you've just been listening to and hopefully singing along with Diana Ross, the Supremes, and Sue as Sue drives her Holden Commodore down to the shops. Sue was a participant in a research project here at the University of Wollongong called Driving Cultures, conducted with Teresa Harada. Sue is a magical person in terms of participating in our project. And Sue is incredibly valuable in terms of thinking about our mobility choices. And this is why Sue participated in our project in terms of thinking about how we move about the city. So in terms of Sue singing, she's really happy. You can see that her joy is infectious. But what has singing in the car got to do with sustainable living? Well, this is where I'd like to introduce you to the notion of keeping it all together. You may have used this term, or you may have heard your friends talking about keeping it all together. The implications of this term is that the work that we do, both the unpaid and the paid, is constantly under strain and has the implications of falling apart at any point in time. Let's return to Sue. Sue's life is constantly under strain, and Sue is really experienced in terms of keeping it all together. Sue is a part-time mum, and Sue is a full-time mum and part-time employed. And Sue is constantly juggling pickups, drop-offs, cooking, cleaning, and shopping. So for Sue, like for many of you, Sue is under strain in her personal life because it's spatially and temporally fragmented. And Sue, like for many of you, are dependent on the automobile in terms of the car, in terms of bringing together all these disparate parts of her life. So in terms of Sue then, we have to ask the question, why does she sing? Well, Sue sings, and she gives us clues for why she sings in terms of, first of all, singing is a way that she actually copes with the strains of life, that singing is a way that she can actually keep it all together. And Sue sings in the car because she can. This is a space that she can be herself, that here she is no longer under the pressures and demands of everybody in her life. And Sue singing, she becomes so joyful that she can actually imagine a different life to the domestic realm that she is in. So in terms of Sue singing, like Sue, you may have also experienced a Thelma and Louise moment, a moment where you imagine a different life to the one that you live at the moment. But what has the singing in the car got to do with sustainability? Well, here I'd like to just talk briefly about cars, personal mobility, and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, more than ever before, we are reliant on the car to move us from place to place. Globally, in 2010, there were over 1 billion passenger cars in the world. And here in Australia, there are 13 million passenger cars, and they're growing at 2% per annum. And each day, there are 165,000 new passenger vehicles rolling off assembly lines. If we turn to ask climate scientists about the contribution of passenger cars to greenhouse gas emissions, they tell us that around about 10% can be attributed to the emissions from passenger vehicles. Well, the question is, what are we going to do about the emissions from our exhaust pipes? So clearly here, engineers and environment are part of the mix. So engineers are doing incredibly important research and development in terms of fuel efficiency, in terms of hybrid, and also in terms of electric cars. Education is about behavioral change. The solution seems straightforward. We simply tell people about the implications of what they're doing, and they will change. However, it's not quite that straightforward. So let me explain why. A consistent finding from large-scale households conducted both here and internationally point to the finding that statistically there is no relationship between the people that know about the implications of their household practices and those people who are actually doing the work of sustainable living. This is called the environmental value action gap. The science of sustainable living simply bounces off in our everyday lives. This finding was consistent from a large-scale survey that was conducted here at the University of Wollongong with my colleagues. In terms of findings from this result, what we discovered is in terms of who is doing the work of sustainable living are those households headed by women and those on lower income. So this points that there is clearly a gender and class politics to sustainable living. Thinking about driving, the results from our large-scale household survey suggested that even amongst the strongest pro-environmental households, that these households, that walking rather than driving to the shops was something that they never or they usually never did. And it's interesting then that thinking about it, that those households most committed to recycling, reducing, and reusing, driving the car less, was something that was non-negotiable. And our large-scale survey of tough times, green times, that was responded to by about 1,500 Illawarra households, in that sample, only 20% were driving less in 2009 than in 2008. And most interestingly, the reasons why they drove less was either unemployment, retirement, or changing household composition. And I was so surprised to discover that only 5%, or around about 25 people, having learned about the implications of climate change, had changed their driving behavior. And similarly, only around 5%, having learned about the health benefits of walking, were driving less. So what are the implications of these results? Well, the implications of these results, they all point to the importance of the social, the cultural, and the emotional forces at play in our mobility choices. One really important force at play is called social capital. That is, we are what we drive. And think about your branded car and how it promotes social status, but also how you can promote social social groupings, or in terms of social differentiation. Another really important social force at play is that of cultural capital. And that, in other words, is that the busy life is the good life. And we're all driving our cars in a frantic whiz, connecting all those places so that we feel that we're living the good life. But you know all that. What's less well rehearsed in the literature are some of the emotional forces at play. And Sue was not alone in telling us about the ways that she used her car as part of a restorative practice. How within the space of the car, she could cocoon herself from the roles and the responsibilities of everyday life. It was time out. It was time for herself. It was a space where she could actually be herself. One respondent spoke about driving in the car as a space, it was like going on a holiday. But there's more emotional forces at play in terms of our mobility choices and driving the car. In terms of, think about the emotional work that is conducted in the car in terms of social relationships. Mobile, yet immobile bodies, strapped in close proximity in the intimate cocoon spaces of the car. They open up possibilities to do the emotional labor as friends, as parents, as partners. Here's an example from Sarah. She talks about how the space of the car is where she can do the mothering work with her daughter. The space of the car has become this incredibly important space where we can deal with family relationships. I want you to think about your own car talk. I want you to think about all the intimate subjects that you have broached in the space of the car. So, let's return to my opening question. What has singing in the car got to do with sustainable living? And here I want you to help us use Sue's singing in the car to help us rethink in terms of some dimensions about mobility and sustainable planning. I want us to all think that education alone is not going to change our mobility choices. That in terms of there's too many social, cultural, and emotional forces at play. And we also have to remember in terms of transport planners that in terms of our mobility choices, there's much at play in terms of how we move from A to B. They're not underpinned by rational choices, but our mobility choices have the capacity to take us everywhere and anywhere. And thinking through our sustainable campaigns often make the assumption that they're speaking to drivers or consumers. But what we learn is that the way that we use our cars helps to sustain ourselves as students, as professionals, as mums and dads. And the way that we use our cars helps us do the work of everyday life. But more so, it also helps sustain our sense of ourselves to do the work of everyday life, and thereby keeping it all together. Thank you.